A very powerful House Republican coming out against the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank.
What? Something weird and remarkable and good is happening in Washington. More politicians are taking a clear stand against corporate welfare.
You really want to turn your back on tradition?
Yeah, some of us do.
It is wrong for the government to choose winners and send your money to corporations.
That's what the government's Export-Import Bank does. But the new majority leader said this week
the private sector can do it.
That upsets some businesses.
Our Ex-Im Bank needs to be reauthorized.
It upsets Democrats.
Every other developed nation in the world has an export credit authority.
We're in for an unusually clear and clean fight over corporate welfare.
That's the way the system works.
That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
Capitalism lets entrepreneurs raise money so they can scale up, get their products and services to more people. Where there's free competition, those with the best ideas get more money, and then the best and cheapest products and services spread far and wide. That's why capitalism is great. But then there's crapitalism, crony capitalism. That's where capitalists partner with politicians, and the politicians give your money to capitalists because the politicians know who's most deserving of help. Or so they say. I call that corporate welfare, or crapitalism. There are a bunch of government agencies that fuel this crony capitalism. The Small Business Administration gives out grants, so does the Energy Department. You know about their gifts to companies like Solyndra, but the biggest government supporter of business is the Export-Import Bank. Here's what the bank says about itself.
The Export-Import Bank's financial products enable exporters of all sizes to increase their sales, protect against the risks of international trade, and export with confidence.
Export with confidence. That sounds good. Who can object to that? Well, the chairman of the House Finance Committee, for one, Texas Congressman Jeb Hensarling. So, Congressman, why?
Why do I object?
Yes.
Well, it's pretty clear. I think you got it right. You have a fairly clever term. But it is corporate welfare at the end of the day. Now, 1 in 1,000 probably have never heard of the Export-Import Bank. The one who does receives a financial benefit. That's substantially Fortune 500 companies like GE, like Boeing, who could easily finance these things themselves. And so, John, you have the Export-Import Bank claiming they create American jobs, but we just heard testimony that when the Export-Import Bank helps Boeing to sell a jet to Air India, it hurts Delta Airlines. There's thousands of pilots they can't help. We've also heard, for example, from Valero Energy in my state of Texas, when Export-Import Bank helps, for example, GE and others to build an oil refinery in Turkey, it hurts the domestic refining industry. And so on, as one economist has put it, for every job Export-Import creates in exports, they kill an American job domestically. So it's not helping us. And then, John, it's costing the taxpayer money.
But what people can see, what you're up against, is that you can see the jobs created at Boeing, and they have a concentrated interest in lobbying. But maybe the guys at Valero, and you have the Valero example, but the smaller companies, they don't even know what's happening to them.
Well, John, I think I know what the challenges are ahead of me. By being in the midst of this fight, I've probably put, 1,000 lobbyist kids through college. Anybody who can spell lobbyist has now gotten a contract to go lobby in favor of Ex-Im. But, it's just not fair, And again, I know a lot of people haven't heard of it, but I got a small business in my district run by a guy named Hal Richards in Terrell, Texas. He says, I export. I don't use Ex-Im, and yet it's my taxpayer money that's being sent to countries like China and Russia and the Sudan where there's human rights abuses.
All right, but Congressman, please respond to what the bank says here in its commercial for itself.
With the Export-Import Bank, U.S. exporters from bustling city centers to local family farms can turn once distant business possibilities into reality. International Building Systems of Texas makes prefabricated houses for export. Their buyers range from the swamps of Nigeria to the deserts of Algeria. Naturally, lenders were wary of extending loans because of the countries involved. With our guarantee, lenders felt reassured.
Lenders felt reassured. Isn't that wonderful?
Well, what we hear, John, is that once lenders know that it's the taxpayers' money that's on the line, they quit doing their due diligence. They don't care about the risk because it's not on their balance sheet, it's on the taxpayers' balance sheet. Last I looked, the national debt is $17 trillion and increasing. I keep a national debt clock going in our committee room. I don't think the taxpayer wants this on their balance sheet. And again, this is all about kind of the Washington insider economy versus the Main Street competitive economy. I mean, the face of XM is going to be some small business in my state. But the true beneficiaries, again, are Fortune 500 companies that could easily finance this themselves. And instead, they're financing, a lobby effort to keep this thing going, and you can't even say they create net new jobs. And we just had testimony from the Congressional Budget Office that if XM would use Main Street accounting, GAAP accounting, what we call fair value accounting, they're losing money for the taxpayer. And it's not right, it's not fair, it doesn't create jobs, it costs taxpayer money. We ought to end the corporate welfare, and yet my Democratic friends say the only way we can help exports is with subsidies. Why don't we have a regulatory...
Your Republican friends, too.
Well, regrettably, a number of those. We are helping to inform their discretion and their knowledge at the moment. But why don't we have a free enterprise alternative? We have the highest corporate tax rate of any industrialized nation in the world. If we want, quote unquote, a level playing field, let's bring down the corporate tax rate.
Thank you, Congressman Henserling. As you say, I agree with you. Only free enterprise is moral, part of your argument for this. But now let's hear from the other side. Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman is also on the Finance Committee. Congressman, you just listened to your committee chair. He's wrong?
Well, John, I know you oppose reauthorizing the XM Bank, and so does Jeb. So you have two people on one side, one on the other. But the argument for extending the XM Bank is more than twice as good, so it is a fair fight. The fact is that we don't live in the novels of Ayn Rand. You can live in the Fountainhead, you can live in Atlas Shrugged. There's no XM Bank in those books. But also in those books, Germany doesn't have an XM Bank, Japan doesn't have an XM Bank, China doesn't have one, and neither does South Korea. What we're talking about here is unilateral military disarmament. Now, I watch Fox a lot, and I see Democrats accused of unilateral disarmament. This is the first time that Republicans are so anxious to engage in it. If we don't promote exports, buyers are smart, and they'll go not necessarily for the best product, but for the best financing.
So
and this
if
is
other
Airbus
countries are
versus
jumping
Boeing.
off a bridge, we should jump off a bridge? Isn't this what our parents warned us against?
This isn't jumping off a bridge. Germany, for example, has an XM Bank 3 times as large as ours.
It just steals from taxpayers.
Three times as large as ours.
Steals 3 times as much.
Their economy is doing much better than ours. Their manufacturing workers making more than ours, and they are not running the huge trade deficit. You know, Jeb talked about that the national debt that he keeps a clock running on. He wants to cut taxes. That increases the national debt. Then he wants to get rid of XM Bank. That increases the national debt because XM Bank makes money for the taxpayer and returns the money to the Treasury. And the only way he can erase that
Fannie
is to
and Freddie made money until they didn't. The flood insurance program made money until it didn't.
The difference there is that you've got a fair reserve calculated by the Congressional Budget Office for any risks that are assumed, and then you can look over a period of time as transactions are completed, and you see that the fees charged by XM Bank make a profit for the taxpayer. We're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs. Every industrialized country in the world says this is the way to get jobs. We've got the largest trade deficit in the world. Germany has one of the largest surpluses in the world. Which do you want to imitate?
If this is the way to get jobs, why are you so cheap? Why don't we triple the size of the Exim Bank and subsidize all kinds of people. Why don't we pay to sell ice to Eskimos?
I don't think we can make money by selling ice to Eskimos. The Exim Bank is not subsidized. It subsidizes the Treasury. It subsidizes the loss of in the Treasury for all those loopholes that you want to keep going with. I think the Exim Bank should get a bit bigger. I don't think it has to get that. And ultimately, though,
but if it's so good, why
is
not make it much bigger?
What we need to do is negotiate with the Europeans to shrink theirs and ours simultaneously. The only way you get disarmament is you go into the talks with arms. You don't disarm first, sing kumbaya, and then beg the other side to disarm. Not even George McGovern proposed that in arms control, and I don't think you should propose it when it comes to controlling the efforts of foreign governments to subsidize their exports.
So that's your goal. If we keep ours, maybe we can get rid of theirs, and then we could get rid of the Exim Bank?
We are in negotiations now to downscale and eliminate export authorities of this type. They'll be difficult negotiations, but if we throw away XM before we go into those negotiations, you can guarantee failure.
Now, Congressman, you cite the companies that get help, but what about the side effects? When you help Boeing sell a plane to a foreign airline, you do give that airline a special break, and that hurts Americans who work for, say, Delta. Here's what Delta's CEO said at your hearing.
Well, Delta.
A prime example is Air India, a government-owned, government-subsidized airline that drove us out of the marketplace with $1 billion of Exim Bank financing. That cost about 1,000 jobs.
If I can get a word in here...
You're taking 1,000 jobs.
If I can get a word in here, Delta gets benefits from the Canadian Exim Bank to buy Canadian aircraft. So when Delta is deciding whether to buy the Canadian aircraft, the European or the American aircraft, they look for the best financing package. So how are we going to be able to sell our planes abroad if even Delta Airlines is looking for export financing?
So how is this free
enterprise? They didn't tell you that, did they?
This is crony capitalism.
We live in an imperfect world, John.
Right,
we live in a world where
you,
China has a much larger Exim Bank than we do.
Now, you at home, what do you think? Keep the bank? Dump it? Please tweet me at FBN Stossel using that hashtag EximBank. Let us know what you think. And coming up, the cronies explain why the bank is so great.
All this stuff can be confusing. That's why the cronies are standing by to help legislators like you make the right choice.
Thanks, Big G. We almost made a big mistake.
Also, it appears that some of the Exim Bank's loan officers took bribes. But this congresswoman says, hey, that happens everywhere.
That's the way the system works. Anybody that understands any business, there are always going to be people that are going to try to rig the system.
I get it. Those loans are actually subsidies for big corporations.
Backed by taxpayers.
That's right, Johnny. And when it comes to picking winners and losers, who has more experience than Big G?
Big G is big government, of course, and that the group that made that cartoon is upset that government's big spending steals opportunities from younger people like them. But picking winners is something lots of Americans want their elected politicians to do. Someone needs to decide which industries deserve America's support, right? And we're busy. We can't analyze every company to decide which is worthy. That's why we elect politicians. What's wrong with this logic? Let's ask the economist who Congressman Hensarling sometimes quotes when he argues against the Exim Bank. That's Don Boudreau of George Mason University. So I have a life. I can't decide what companies are better and ought to get some export support. It's government's job.
No, it's the free market's job. The direction of resources is determined by how consumers spend their money and how investors invest. And competition sorts it all out. It does it much better, and it does it with a lot less favoritism than the political process could ever possibly do it.
But the politicians, both parties, are citing, look at all these people have been helped, these jobs that have been created.
Yeah, you can point to the jobs that have been created. What you don't see are the jobs that have not been created. You cannot create a job over here by spending more money over here, because without, at the same time, costing jobs over here, because you're taking money from here and you're moving it over here. It's easy to see that.
It's easy to see the gains.
It's easy to see the gains, but you miss the losses. And these people pretend as if the losses don't exist because they're pointing to what you can see, but what you don't see is just as real, even if it's invisible.
And what you don't see is the money taken from people in taxes where they invest less.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Or the overseas firm, which now has this discount, and the American firm loses the business.
That's right. You have some American firms who are not able to get started. You have some American firms that are not able to expand. You can point to the firms in America that expand and sell more, mostly Boeing, by the way. Hardly a small little firm that needs Uncle Sam's help.
But they'll lose the business to this European company which subsidizes even more.
Well, they surely will lose some business if we kill the XM Bank. But other American firms will gain business. And the resources will be allocated better. Consumers' manner of spending money will direct how the resources get spent and what happens, not politicians.
The cartoon video, The Cronies, points out that the XM Bank has been doling out favors for 80 years.
You really want to turn your back on tradition? It's given a helping hand out to some great American companies, like Enron, Solyndra, and Boeing. So that no vote could mean fewer contributions to your re-election campaign.
Gee, I hadn't thought of that.
That's a big part, that those companies hire lobbyists, give money to the politicians who support it.
Yeah, it's crony capitalism. Pure and simple, crony capitalism.
Crapitalism. That's my word.
Yeah, I like that. I like that word. Look, what the XM Bank does is pay foreigners to consume our products. Why should we pay foreigners to consume our products? And that's what it does. That's what it boils down to.
Because it creates jobs, and they say it hasn't cost America a penny. In fact, the bank returned $1.5 billion to the Treasury over the past 5 years.
Yeah, so it says. So the XM Bank says. The CBO did a study just last month in which it found, using better accounting methods, that in fact the XM Bank probably lost about $2 billion.
But they get to use these phony accounting methods.
Yeah, if a private company uses kind of accounting methods, they would be sued for fraud.
Now, other companies subsidize exports.
Other countries do subsidize exports, but your mother, when you were young, probably said, look, if other kids jump off the bridge, would you do it? Those subsidies hurt those economies. Why should we then say, we're going to hurt ourselves just as much as you're hurting yourself? That's what those subsidies are about. We're inflicting wounds on ourselves because other countries are doing the same thing to their economies.
Now, as you mentioned, Boeing gets half the money, by far, most of the money. Right down the list is GE, and here's what General Electric says about the bank. Actually, they won't talk to us, but they made this commercial.
The president wants to double exports. He should double the size of the bank.
So that the U.S. government can really go out there and support U.S. companies as they seek to compete abroad to help support American exports and American workers.
At the end of that, it says, your imagination at work, or something like that. GE, this is imagination.
Well, they should use their imagination and try to imagine the jobs that are not created. Imagine the products that are not produced. Imagine the consumers in America who are poorer because their tax monies are being taken to be spent in ways that they don't choose, but the way that politicians in Washington choose. Imagine that. That's not a good thing to imagine.
Those people, 300 million of them, they don't each have a lobbyist making the case.
That's exactly right. They don't. But Boeing does, and GE does, and big corporations do.
But the politicians aren't just whores. They believe in this. They say, this is my job, to support American business.
Well, they may, but then they're wrong. I mean, they're economically mistaken. I don't doubt it's good for their jobs, but they're economically mistaken.
Thank you, Don Boudreau. Next, corruption at the XM Bank. Apparently, some of those loans happen not because the company's great, but because the company's cronies bribe someone in government. Crapitalism at work. Next. Taxpayers should not have to loan $140 billion to politically connected companies. It's just wrong. Government's lousy at picking winners and losers. The free market does it much better, as Don Pedro said. But more important than efficiency, it's immoral. Government has no business taking your money and giving it to certain companies. The Exim Bank should be killed simply because it's wrong in principle. However, this week, the bank gave politicians another reason to let it die. The Wall Street Journal reports that bank officials are being investigated for taking bribes, kickbacks. Such corruption is not unique to the bank. It often happens when government agencies hand out big money. Tim Carney reports on that all the time. Tim, let's start with the current scandal. Your latest Washington Examiner column says the bank is a petri dish of corruption and graft.
Yeah, I don't think that the bank is full of a bunch of white-collar criminals, or it's anything about the people who work there. I think it's the nature of the bank. When you combine government power and private profit, you've got people handing out other people's money that enrich companies. You're asking for corruption to happen.
And in this case, what they say is that a bank employee took cash to help a Florida company get a loan to send construction equipment to Latin America.
And then we've also got 3 other unnamed officials who were suspended for things like taking gifts from companies that were getting subsidies. So we know that in one case, ExxonMobil gave plane rides to officials before Exxon went ahead and got a subsidy from Export-Import Bank.
You say it's not just the bank, but they did take a survey of their employees in 2013. Question: my organization's leaders maintain high standards of honesty and integrity. Do you agree? 42%. Disagree, 29%. That's pretty high.
Yeah, so it's, again, we end up with a situation where a bunch of people are in the position of handing out money. And unlike some government programs where every player in an industry gets a subsidy, not every exporter gets an Export-Import Bank subsidy. Only less than 2% of exports get a subsidy. So it really is picking winners and losers. I think you put anybody in that situation, then you're going to get questions about honesty and integrity. There's going to be such an opportunity for kickbacks.
And one congressman who got caught was William Jackson. What did he do?
William Jefferson was caught with $90,000 in his fridge, and now he's in jail. He got a 13-year sentence on bribery charges. And one of the things he did was demand bribes from a Nigerian company and from a U.S. company, and then he brought them together at the Export-Import Bank as part of what they were paying him for. And the funny thing is, when that deal fell apart, he went and he found another Nigerian company, brought it together with the same Virginia company, again taking bribes at the Export-Import Bank.
And the Nigerians got to the bank because Maureen Edu was indicted for taking a $100,000 bribe. She worked at the bank.
Yeah, so Edu was a bank official, and she just got wired $100,000. And the Nigerian businessman who sent it to her, when he requested the money from his own bank, he said, well, this is a facilitation payment to Maureen Edu for helping us get money. It was pretty cut and dried.
But yesterday at the Exim Bank hearing, Congresswoman Carolyn McCarthy implied some corruption's no surprise.
Yes, they found 4 employees. They did an investigation, and they let them go. That's the way the system works. Anybody that understands any business, there are always going to be people that are going to try to rig the system.
That's the way the system works.
That's the way the system works when you have the government involved, when you have bureaucrats providing profit to private players and getting to pick and choose who's getting it. There are some government programs where you meet a certain standard, you get the benefit, or you get the tax break. I oppose those, but those don't provide the opportunity for corruption as the Export-Import Bank does, because, again, politicians, bureaucrats are going and they're picking winners and losers, deciding this guy gets a subsidy, this guy doesn't.
Fannie and Freddie provide the opportunity, too. A Fannie Mae executive was fired for taking kickbacks. You wrote about that.
And so in 2013, a Fannie Mae executive was let go, and there was a criminal scheme where some of the middlemen who got involved as brokers between when it came to foreclosed properties that Fannie Mae was involved in. So it was another one of these situations where Fannie Mae, a government-owned business, was playing with other people's money. And once you're doing that, once you see that you are handing out somebody else's money, then you're putting the person who's handing out the money in position to demand a bribe.
The Republicans say we can fix this, some Republicans, with reforms, the ones who don't want to kill it. You buy that?
No, because every time the Export-Import Bank is reauthorized, there's a promise of reforms. Oh, we're going to stop giving all our money to just 10 big businesses. Or, oh, we're going to stop subsidizing foreign manufacturers that might kill jobs back here. And they never really successfully follow through on those reforms. Even if they follow the letter of the law, it doesn't do what they want. If you want to get rid of the corruption and the opportunity for the kickbacks, the only way to do it is to get the politicians out of the position of giving out this money. The only way to do it is to kill the Export-Import Bank.
So I hope they do. Thank you, Tim Carney. Coming up, I'll fight with one of the biggest lobbyists on this list of companies that just love a government bank.
The Ex-Im Bank finances the wealthiest, most profitable airlines in the world with huge amounts of our Treasury dollars.
That was the CEO of Delta Airlines yesterday, complaining that the government's Export-Import Bank rips off taxpayers at the expense of companies like his. He's one of the few corporate executives willing to speak against the bank. Here's a list of companies and trade associations that lobby for or against the Ex-Im Bank. Oops, actually all but Delta lobby for the bank. This should come as no surprise. This is the principle of concentrated benefits versus diverse costs. Companies that may win loan guarantees can win big. It pays to spend money to lobby, and it might win you a multi-million-dollar loan. But when you pay for the loan, pay maybe a few $100. It's not worth it for you or me to hire a lobbyist. Hence, we get the lobbyist industrial complex. When government hands out big money, that will create a whole industry of politically connected people devoted to grabbing the money. And one of those people is John Hardy. He's president of the Coalition for Employment Through Exports, which is a great sounding name. We all want employment through exports. I see you're here about number 5 on this list of lobbyists between Ford Motor Company and the bankers. And why is this a good thing, what you do? You're a parasite feeding off the taxpayer.
No, not at all. These are companies that are facing severe competition overseas. What the bank does is it levels the playing field.
The playing field is level until the government comes in.
No, the playing field is not. You've got export credit agencies from all of the major countries with which we compete. And the only way in which you can level the financing playing field is by enabling Ex-Im to provide comparable financing so that now the buyer can focus on the quality of the product that he's actually purchasing and not on the financing terms and conditions.
So, as the economist said earlier, because other countries are throwing taxpayer money at some companies, we have to too?
This is a bank that makes a profit. It charges fees, it charges interest. The buyers pay for the financing that is available.
The bank has made a profit. For years, it didn't lose a penny, and more recently, it returned some money to the Treasury.
Since 2006, the bank has returned $7.2 billion to the U.S. Treasury.
Well, that sounds good, except, you know, Fannie and Freddie made money until they didn't make money. My favorite, federal flood insurance, they made money until they didn't. Now they're $20 billion in the red.
This bank is very conservatively managed. Its loan loss rate at this point is 0.23%, less than 1/4%.
But then the private sector would fund it if these are good loans.
The private sector, after the financial crisis, is now in a situation where it's subject to new regulatory constraints. They simply don't have the liquidity, and what liquidity they have is far more expensive because they now have additional capital reserves that they were required to provide. At the same time, we're in a situation where the emerging markets are exploding. We have billions of new people moving into the middle class, and there are tremendous opportunities.
Well, where there's opportunity, a private bank, I would think, would fund it. I mean, Boeing has $4 billion in its finance arm.
One of the dilemmas of export finance is it's high in liquidity and low in return. So the bottom line is that commercial banks will certainly take a slice, but they're not going to be heavily investing in it because now they have to make more of a return for their shareholders. So the bottom line is,
because of regulation meant to protect us, we now have to subsidize more companies?
But you're not subsidizing it. It's at market rates. And we operating consistent with an OECD arrangement where...
All right, OECD, we're getting into the wonky area here.
Okay.
As I said,
it's an international agreement that
I'm sure there are plenty
the export
of
credit agencies are now working under that provides established terms and conditions for financing.
As I said, the one company on the lobbying list that's argued against the bank is Delta Airlines. Here's more of what Delta's CEO said yesterday.
I've had many conversations with the CEOs of the most profitable airlines in the world. And they tell me, look, I don't really need the Ex-Im Bank financing, but it's so cheap, I might as well take it. This is effectively a free airplane every 8th airplane. All I want is a level playing field.
You've taken away the level playing field by subsidizing this competition.
No, because we're not subsidizing the competition. The reality is that indeed there was a new international agreement on aircraft, which has made financing, particularly for the better credit airlines, far more expensive. And the reality is that it is now less expensive to get it financed through the private sector than it is to use export credit agencies. But there's one problem, and it's what I just mentioned before. There's no liquidity because the commercial banks are not prepared to invest the magnitude of capital. We're talking about for wide-body aircraft,
then maybe we don't need so many wide-body aircraft. Why?
But the difficulty is this, and I'm glad that you raised this issue, and that is there's always another party on the other side of the table. In this case, it's Airbus. They have export credit agencies.
They do.
They are very aggressive. They are more aggressive than Ex-Im is.
So they're throwing money off a cliff. We should throw money off a cliff.
But the reality is, are we in a position where you actually want to cripple Delta's Boeing's ability to actually sell aircraft overseas?
We have the Bank of Boeing. They'll still sell. They say they'll keep going.
It's not just about Boeing. It's about the whole spectrum of top-tier manufacturers in the United States trying to compete in marketplaces all over the developing world against major export credit agencies that are far more aggressive.
Without government, with government, it's crapitalism, crony capitalism. Thank you, John Hardy, for putting up with me. So the lobbying odds are stacked. Businesses that get handouts will always lobby hard for more. Fortunately, though, there are a few free market groups that lobby back and punish politicians who support crapitalism. We'll learn about that next. Not every lobbying group lobbies to get more money for themselves. A few just believe in something and fight for that. One of those groups is the Club for Growth. It defends economic freedom. It's supported by some businesses and rich people, but the Club for Growth opposes all special favors to business and all bailouts. It opposed the Wall Street bailout, the auto bailout, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and so on. They lobby to unseat big government politicians, including Republicans. When Senator Arlen Specter supported the stimulus and later Obamacare, the club backed his opponent, Pat Toomey, who eventually became a senator. When Florida Governor Charlie Crist endorsed the stimulus package and then ran for the Senate, the club ran ads like this.
We know that it's important that we pass a stimulus package.
Tell Governor Crist to work on fixing Florida's economy, not passing more debt to our children.
The club supported Marco Rubio, who defeated Governor Crist. And now they're fighting the Export-Import Bank. Good. Barney Keller works for the club, and I admit I've been fans of you guys for a long time, attended some of your meetings. So might this really be a turning point when Republicans stop feeding at the trough and say, enough already?
Yeah, well, the Export-Import Bank is, it's kind of funny. It's a little-known agency, but it's become this symbol for crony capitalism in America. I think that people are starting to realize, John, that there's a difference between being pro-business and being pro-free market. Those two things are not always the same, and that's what we've seen over this debate in the Export-Import Bank, is that on one side you have, the Chamber of Commerce or the Chamber of Crony Capitalists that supported the stimulus and the Wall Street bailout.
Well, they're more than that. They do some good things.
They do some good things, and we agree with them a lot of stuff, but they also, support big government programs a lot of times, like the Export-Import Bank. And on the other side, you have groups like us, the pro-free market side, that believes that, economic freedom leads to wealth and prosperity for all Americans. And that's why we got to stop things like the Export-Import Bank.
Expand on the example Tim Carney started to give. Exxon got funding after paying for a trip for some Exim Bank employees.
Yeah, it's just another example of what everybody hates about Washington. People with well-connected lobbyists, can hire somebody like that, and they can go out there and get a loan or a subsidy from the government that isn't available to you and me. And we're not.
The government workers ran up $97,000 in bills traveling to London, Tokyo, and the South Pacific. 11 months later, the bank approved $3 billion in financing, the biggest gift loan in the agency's 75 years.
Yeah, it's amazing. And 60% of the loans go to one company, Boeing, and they're the company that's lobbying the most to keep the bank. So it's what's wrong with Washington, John. I mean, it's part of why Americans don't trust politicians anymore. It's because
there's a lot wrong with Washington.
There's a lot wrong.
This is part of it. Yeah, wrong.
Of course.
Just one more example where John Boudreau talked about. You can see the jobs gained. It's harder to see the jobs lost.
Right.
The Exim loan gift to Caterpillar hurt iron ore miners in America. Explain that.
Well, basically what happened is Caterpillar wanted to send their mining equipment to the richest woman in Australia for the Roy Hill mine. So they provided these loan guarantees for these exports.
$700 million.
Exactly. And these iron ore miners in Minnesota and Michigan are looking and saying, hey, where's my handout? Now you're making our foreign competitor more competitive with us. How come we're not the ones getting the subsidy? So on every side of the coin, there's jobs won and jobs lost.
The miners don't have lobbyists.
They must not have as good ones.
Thank you, Barney Keller of the Club for Growth. Keep fighting. Coming up, my take on why this fight is, I think, a remarkable turning point. Finally, more politicians realize there is a difference between capitalism and crapitalism.
America, rated PG-13, in theaters Wednesday, July 2nd.
The Exim Bank is just one of several government bureaucracies that give your money to favored businesses. When the money's squandered, sometimes we hear about that. Most of us heard that the Energy Department lost $500 million of your dollars on Solyndra. But we heard little about the department's other losses, like Solar One, the Triad ethanol plant, FutureGen, the Clinch River breeder reactor, and so on. The list is long. And when the lists are long, we tune out. People get scandal fatigue. But even when there isn't a scandal, government has no business handing out money or loan guarantees to companies. It's just wrong. Corporations should pay their own way. The Agriculture Department's Market Access Program gives $200 million to the Pet Food Institute, the Wine Institute, to Sunkist and Welch's Food. In return, politicians get campaign contributions. That's disgusting. Even the Small Business Administration is an embarrassment. They loaned $1 million to a Lamborghini dealership, which then closed. They loaned $3 million to a Rolex dealer. This is where your tax money should go? But the name Small Business Administration just sounds nice. The government says the SBA exists to aid, counsel, assist, and protect the interests of small business. How can I argue with that? Doesn't America need a small business policy like it needs an energy policy, an export policy, and so on? No, we already have one. It's called the free market. And it's great at determining which exports or solar panels or small businesses are worthy and which are not. Those that attract customers and make a profit, then they support themselves. Government need not be involved except to make sure companies don't steal or cheat. Did you know there's a bureaucracy called the Economic Development Administration that gives out $300 million a year? Bet you didn't. The EDA spent your money on so much economic development they even paid for things like a wine tasting room and a gift shop in Washington state. Really? One fiscally conservative congressman came on this show a few years ago to complain about the EDA.
The Economic Development Administration takes about $300 or $400 million a year from you, the taxpayer, and brings that money to Washington, D.C. and distributes it politically across
economic development.
They distribute it across a couple of hundred congressional districts. They are a political animal.
They are, and they shouldn't exist. Congressman Pompeo said he'd try to kill the EDA. He failed. He didn't even come close. And check out this other politician who promised he'd put an end to both the EDA and the Import-Export Bank.
I'm not a Democrat who believes that we can or should defend every government program just because it's there. There's some that don't work, like waste at the Economic Development Agency and the Export-Import Bank that's become little more than a fund for corporate welfare.
A fund for corporate welfare. It is. But now, instead of getting rid of it, the president wants the bank to loan out even more of your money. Give me a break. Once they get to Washington and breathe in all that money and power, they change. Politicians love spending other people's money. Except, maybe, just maybe, the Tea Party changed things. If they do kill the Export-Import Bank and then stop other corporate welfare, it's a first step towards saving America. That's our show. See you next week.